and welcome to our discussion today. And let's make it quick. What happens is we have we are now going to talk about the mechanisms of fibrosis and how does healing by fibrosis and scar tissue formation comes about. This is the objective of today's discussion. How this process of fibrosis unfolds. What are the steps that lead to it? But before we do that, let us just recap real quick what has led to us arriving at this stage in our discussion. Like, what are the previous steps that led to healing by fibrosis? We talked about how a normal, healthy tissue is comprised of normal, healthy cells. These normal, healthy cells are always in under constant noxious and harmful attack by injurious agents and noxious stimuli and stressful stimuli. And once these healthy cells overcome that stressful attack projected from the extracellular environment and also from the intracellular environment, you have mechanisms like misfolded proteins, and you have intracellular stress and extracellular stress. But the cell is equipped with built-in systems to defend itself and to repair all the damages and to counter all the stress and the attack that comes from the outside. And the cell would go right back into the state of homeostasis and health. However, sometimes for our purposes, pathology purposes, the cell, due to the stressful stimuli being so severe in intensity, or due to the stimuli being applied for such a very long time, now that would overwhelm the cellular capacity to withstand that stress. And those built-in systems would collapse because they're overwhelmed with so much pressure and so much intensity and so much severity and duration of that stressful stimuli. So now we would move on from a cell that was in a state, a cell that was in the state of homeostasis would now go to the state of cell injury. And cell injury is not the end. From cell injury, we can have reversible cell injury. The cell can still reverse that injury and go back to a normal cell in the state of homeostasis, provided that we have the proper conditions. However, if the intensity is so severe and the duration is so long and the damage is beyond salvage, if the damage is beyond salvage, we would move on from cell injury into irreversible cell injury. And from irreversible cell injury, there is one pathway, and that is cell death. If a cell is injured irreversibly, there is no going back. The cell must die. How will the cell die? Either one of two ways. Apoptosis, where the cell will get rid of itself properly in a smooth and spontaneous way, where the cellular membrane would not be fragmented and intercellular content of the cell would not leak out. These lysosomal enzymes would not cause damage in nearby tissue, and the aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation is happening spontaneously because the mitochondria is not defected. So the mitochondria would initiate apoptosis and the cell would remove itself and commit programmed cell death, and nearby cells in the tissue would proliferate to make up for the loss of these injured cells, and you have tissue stem cells in addition to the cells regenerating. You have tissue stem cells. These progenitor cells would develop to make up for that loss. However, if the death is not by apoptosis, if the death is by necrosis due to the severity of the microbial attack, or maybe the ultraviolet radiation, we talked about these different stimuli that lead, these different injurious stimuli, the ultraviolet radiation, the physical agents, severe increase in temperature, severe decrease in temperature, the chemical agents, these corrosive agents. You have the traumas, you have microbial attacks by viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites, and so on. So the damage is so much, you would have fragmentation of the this is the thin line between apoptosis and necrosis. The thin line is two things. You have the cell membrane whether is it intact or not. If the cell membrane is intact, so we will not have necrosis, we would have apoptosis. But if the cell membrane is destroyed, you would have osmolar fluctuations, and you would have leakage of intracellular lysosome enzymes that would go to the nearby tissue and cause so much damage and elicit inflammation. And if the mitochondria is defected, aerobic respiration would halt and stop, and we would have so many enzymes that require ATP from the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, which is damaged. They cannot do their function. Even apoptosis is triggered and propagated by enzymes. But unfortunately, due to the damage being so severe, what we would have now is death by necrosis. So after death by necrosis, there is one pathway, and that is the next step would be inflammation and acute inflammation. In acute inflammation, we talked about how we have cells, immune cells circulating the bloodstream. And we have two types. We have the polymorphonuclear cells, the neutrophils that arrive first to the site of the inflammation. And we also have monocytes, which are primitive, undifferentiated macrophages. Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. Allah Akbar. Okay. This is the call to prayer. It's currently 4:30 a.m. It's time to pray. So let me wrap up real quick. Okay. We said we have inflammation, and from inflammation we have, like I said, we have monocytes, which are undifferentiated, primitive macrophages. Remember the show, the Pokemon, where you have Pikachu like evolving into something that is bigger. I forgot what that is. I can never remember that. But I was so young at the time. But anyways, you have these monocytes differentiating into macrophages and polymorphonuclear cells being activated. And when the cytokines are released from the site of the inflammation by the sentinel resident macrophages, we said in the tissue we have so many different kinds of sentinel resident cells, like the mast cells, dendritic cells, and the macrophages, such as depends on where are you in the body. In the spleen and in the lymph nodes, you have sinus histocytes. In the lungs, you have alveolar macrophages. In the liver, you have Kupffer cells. And in the nervous system, you have microglia. They are resident, and they are like police precincts. Once there is an inflammation or a defect or necrosis, they would send cytokines to the bloodstream. These circulating monocytes would detect these cytokines. Polymorphonuclear cells, neutrophils, would detect these cytokines, and they would differentiate, and by chemotaxis, they would follow these chemokines to the site of the inflammation. The blood vessels are comprised of endothelial cells. These endothelial cells themselves have receptors that respond to the cytokines released from the site of the inflammation, and that would cause the retraction of endothelial cell retraction. And after the endothelial cell retraction, you have these immune cells, these polymorphonuclear cells, and the monocytes that became macrophages would leak out through the endothelial gaps, use their metalloproteases, these enzymes, to degrade connective tissue to make themselves path in order to follow these chemokines to the site of the inflammation. Once they get to the site of the inflammation, they start galloping and swallowing and engulfing all of the necrotic debris and all of the microbes, and that is known as the classical pathway of the macrophages, M1. Once the macrophages have removed all the necrotic debris and all the infective agents, there will be a shift in the pathway of the macrophages. We would move from M1, classical pathway of macrophages, the microbicidal macrophage pathway, M1, to M2, which is the healing pathway, and that stimulates the releases TGF-beta, which is the most important cytokines in the process of healing by fibrosis, and the process of recruiting fibroblasts. And these fibroblasts would secrete so much collagen, and so much collagen would be first in the form of collagen type 3, which is a little bit weaker, but as the remodeling phase kicks in, we would move from collagen type 3 into collagen type 1, which is more tensile and more strong, and we would now have a scar formation. Okay, let's see what we have here. We have an intact endothelium that underwent tissue harm caused by the projection of noxious stimuli or injurious agents that led to the loss of structural and functional integrity of the tissues. And we gave example like ultraviolet radiation, the microbes, the physical agents, and the trauma. So that damage now would release so many cytokines. These cytokines would, that the first step is actually the injury, the projection of the attack. After that, we would have step 2, either 2A or 2B. 2A is when the tissue harm is reversible and limited. We have a reversible limited injury. And then by regeneration, we would go right back to being normal, healthy cells. However, in irreversible injury, what happens is we would have necrotic, we would have cell death that is either by apoptosis. If it's by apoptosis, we would go back to being normal cells through regeneration. However, if it's by necrosis, what we would have is we would have inflammation. We would move on from irreversible injury to inflammation. So step number 3 is inflammation. In inflammation, we would have the recruitment of T lymphocytes and other lymphoid cells, while the macrophages would come and engulf all of the necrotic debris and all of the microbial agents and gulp and swallow them and get rid of them properly. Once inside the macrophage, you have the phagocytic lysosomes containing the intracellular debris, the necrotic debris of damaged tissue, and you have these phagocytic vesicles also containing microbial agents like these viruses, parasites, fungi, and the bacteria. And then you have lysosomal lysosomal vesicles, and the two vesicles would move together where the lysosomal enzymes would degrade the intracellular content of the phagocytic lysosome containing the necrotic debris and also containing the necrotic debris and also the microbial agents that are in there were engulfed by the macrophage. So after the macrophage removes all of the dangerous stimuli, what happens is now it's time to repair. So now the macrophage will secrete TGF-beta. This is very important. TGF-beta is the most important cytokine that is released by the macrophages to initiate fibrosis. TGF-beta. And other T lymphocytes will secrete cytokine like interleukin-13, and that would stimulate the fibroblast recruitment and differentiation. So fibroblasts would come to the site of the injury, and they would secrete so much collagen, and that would be collagen type 3, that is weaker. And then in the phase of the remodeling, we will move from collagen type 3 into collagen type 1, which is more tensile and more stronger. And then we would replace all of the injurious tissue here that is caused by the irreversible injury. We will now have healing by fibrosis because there's so much collagen caused by the fibroblasts. So the fibroblasts secrete so much collagen, and they arrive at the site of the injury after they respond with their receptors to cytokines released from the site of the injury, like TGF-beta, and then we would have healing by fibrosis. The last thing I want to talk about is angiogenesis. And in angiogenesis, what happens is when it comes to healing, we don't only have cells that are proliferating. So in regeneration, we have 100% of the cells around the injured tissue proliferating to make up for that tissue. And we have tissue stem cells also proliferating to make up for the loss of the lost cells. But when it comes to healing by fibrosis, what happens is we have fibroblasts that come and dump collagen. But in either case, we have angiogenesis, where in proliferation we had cells proliferating In regeneration, we had cells proliferating, and in angiogenesis, we now have blood vessels. Blood vessels proliferating and starting to go out in order to supply the injured tissue with the proper oxygen and nutrients and remove all the metabolic waste and harmful substance. Okay, this was a quick wrap up. If you have a question, please leave it down there, and thank you very much. I'll give you one quick look at what we have. Okay, what do we have here? We have the epithelium, the intact epithelium. We have the intact epithelium that underwent tissue harm that led to the loss of structural and functional integrity of the tissue in the form of ultraviolet radiation, microbes, physical, chemical agents, trauma, and then the damage could either be reversible, limited, the injury is limited, and then through regeneration we'd go back to normal healthy tissue. But in irreversible injury, the pathway 2B, we would have triggering of the inflammation due to cell death by necrosis. Otherwise, cell death by apoptosis would lead us back to regeneration, and we would have macrophages secreting TGF-beta and other metal metalloproteases. They are called metal metalloproteases because they use metal cofactors like zinc. And these are the fibroblasts. Okay, thank you very much.